White text over video of past events. Logo, Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium. Professional Development Series presents Calling 911. Is your cultural organization prepared for an emergency? At the front of a large room, a screen with projected captions and slides. To the left is a wooden podium where two people stand. The woman addresses the audience.
Nobody had an emergency getting here. We agreed, so we should explain what the CCAC and so we provide a great network of cultural administrators who work on accent to come together in network, but also come to professional development, LinkedIn. We really believe that expand our community so much in the past year in the Ukraine. So sessions, this is the same space, so we should always feel free to ask questions, use each other as resources. There's no dumb questions here. We wanted to encourage you to be resources to each other. So we wanted to get a sense of who's in the room today. So could you be so here if you have a museum? Please look around so you could talk to each other too. And could you be green thinking? Could you be so here if you're a theater? Could you be so here if you're from an outdoor space? Could you be so here if you're from a government office? Any other categories I missed? Can you agree?
We'd also like to take this opportunity to share some thank yous. We would like to thank the Art Institute and Lucas Livingston for providing the space, setup, and technology for today. We'd like to thank Kathy Raycan of Efficiency Reporting and Equip for Equality for providing open captioning for our presenters today. We'd also like to thank all of our presenters for being here and sharing their information with us. They are Sally Garrison, who will be joining us via Skype. She's the front of house coordinator from Tempe Center for the Arts. We have Vince Gortner here. He's the director of visitor services from Gortner Arboretum. And Jessica Mitchell, the Region 5 Disability Integration Specialist from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Also, feel free to, normally when you come to some type of arts theater events, I often ask people to turn off their phones, but today we're actually going to encourage you to use social media. Feel free to follow us. CCAC has a handle on Twitter of @culturalaccess, and feel free to post about today's session using the hashtag #ChicagoAccess. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Vince Gortner from the Gortner Arboretum.
Thank you and good afternoon. I think I'm probably the least fun person in this entire room by a considerable margin because, well, one, I'm from an outdoor space, but two, I'm going to talk about something that's not just the most fun topic in the entire world, but I will do my very best to make it reasonably entertaining. So I'll start with just a few minutes of stand-up comedy to get things rolling. I'll then explain to you how I feel that I might be at least marginally qualified to talk to you about this topic. We'll manage your hopefully low expectations of what's going to happen today, and then at the end I'll tie up with some content on emergency planning, just for sake of argument. One of the things that we think about when we do emergency planning is that essentially failing to plan is planning to fail. We live in a very complicated world, and we can't just wing it all the time. There has to be a plan. But there are some certain considerations that you should have when forming a plan. I'm going to give you this quote. It's from Field Marshal Karl Bernhard Graf von Moltke, who you're all very familiar with, I'm sure. He was a general in the Prussian army in the late 1800s, major military strategist. But the idea of this quote is that basically you've got a great plan, but the plan needs to be flexible, it needs to be fluid, because it's a dynamic environment. So I can give you this last quote, and then we're going to get into something more fun. Dwight D. Eisenhower. His quote was, "In preparing for battle, I've always found that plans are useless, but the planning itself is indispensable." And the idea is that the conversations we have in advance of emergencies, the work that we do, the resources that we identify, and the things that we put together in preparation for an emergency, that's indispensable. The actual plan itself, sitting in a 3-ring binder, is somewhat useless on occasion. And of course, because I sourced all of my pictures from the internet, I have to have a funny cat picture. So a cat sitting on top of a high ledge trying to get the balloon and saying, I can see no way in which this carefully laid plan could ever fail. So, in general, we worry about emergencies and how we're going to respond in emergencies because emergencies are by their nature stressful. You could have a fire. The idea, the operating motive for the fire is we need to get outside. You could have incredibly severe weather like a tornado. At that point, we would think about, let's get inside. We could have flooding. Let's get some towels. And then if you have an armed bad person roaming through your thing, then you would mostly want to be able to concentrate on getting invisible if at all possible. Not always the most practical consideration, but let's just talk about stress for a minute and how we react under stress. This little color-coded chart on the right-hand side is pretty looking, but let me tell you what it is. This is concept, there's eustress, there's good functional stress. At the bottom right, you'll see that the white zone is you're tuned out, you're not really paying attention to what's going on, you're kind of oblivious to your surroundings. But as the stress level gets up a little bit, the good stress level actually brings you into a sense of relaxed awareness where you're paying attention to what's happening on. As things get a little bit more interesting, we get into a level of focused awareness where, okay, now you're paying attention and now you're really paying attention to what's happening. So a little more stress can be good. In a true emergency situation, we want to go into code red, which is a high alert state. So we can say this is a confirmed emergency and now is the time to take action. The problem is that without planning, without training, without practice, and without some consideration in advance, people can easily go into the black zone of stress, which is basically stress beyond your capacity to deal with what's happening. People just lock up. You're in an overstressed situation. So when people deal with high-stress situations, the physiological effects of stress, tunnel vision, not paying attention to your surroundings well, auditory exclusion. There are countless stories of people in high-stress situations that just were not able to comprehend or process any information coming in through auditory channels. Loss of fine motor skills. In a true emergency situation, if this is the time for you to fumble with a key or punch a little 3-code number into a program lock, this is very difficult to do under high-stress situations. So essentially, the ideas that we think about when managing or thinking about how people are going to respond to stress, simple things become difficult, difficult things become impossible, but people will fall back on their training. So the training that we provide people, even in times of stress, where they completely lock up, even they will kind of fall into what is potentially a zombie mode, but they'll do what we train them to do. So training can be good. There's some comfort in repetition. There's some comfort in going through a training plan and practicing it. There's comfort in having a really nice ornate emergency plan sitting in a 3-ring binder. It could even be a red 3-ring binder. Then everyone will really think that we are totally prepared for all emergencies. There's comfort in thinking that we have a plan. But with all of the training that we would do on this, there has to be flexibility in it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you this example of an FBI shootout that took place in Miami, Florida in 1986. There were a couple of bank robbers. The bad guys had really good guns. The FBI outnumbered them 8-2, but we had the issue of rigid FBI training versus some combat experience in Vietnam. So I'm going to show you the diagram of, hang on a second. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Probably not the time to discuss an FBI shootout. And you might be asking, how is an FBI shootout even remotely relevant to fire drills? I can answer that question, and I'll tell you where I am in the process. So I work for the Arboretum, a very nice little horticultural museum in the western suburbs, 1,700 acres of trees. It's essentially a horticultural museum, lots of interesting tree species, founded by the Morton family in 1922. Anybody use Morton salt ever? Thank you, appreciate that. 1,700 acres. Last year we had, for the first time ever, we had 1 million visitors, which is kind of a big deal for us. We're going to try and pull that off again, hopefully. Otherwise we're going to get in trouble. We host education programs throughout the year. We have a science research center, which is, oddly enough, is kind of a heavyweight entity in the world of botanical research, who would have thought. But we also host special events, concerts. Over the summer, last 3 years, we had a concert series in the Chicago Symphony Orchestra where 5,000 people would show up, sit in our concert lawn, and sip white wine. It was terrifying for us in many ways. My job in visitor operations focused on security management, security infrastructure, risk management, customer service stuff, things of that nature. Let me tell you, though, that the security aspect of my job is fairly easy because it turns out trees are rather difficult to steal. So at night, we pretty much lock the place up, and we come back, and the same trees are usually there in the morning. So the security part, not a big deal. The safety part, though, is something we really do spend a lot of time on. We have people doing, we have 300 employees, some of them are doing hazardous jobs. We want to make sure that we're doing, and when we do have 5,000 people traipsing around our property, we want to make sure that we can act in a way that's responsible for their safety. So how I got here, I've been here about 3 years. I used to be a mechanical engineer. I had a perfectly nice job. It was a pleasant existence. I decided to throw that all away so I could become a police officer because it looked cool. And it turns out it really was cool. Here's me conducting my favorite pastime of sitting in an unmarked car with a radar gun hanging out the window so that I could meet interesting people and write them speeding tickets. Very enjoyable pastime for me. I used my engineering degree to pursue the field of accident reconstruction. And I thought that would be interesting, and honestly it was. But as my job got more complicated, I thought of this great idea that I could solve all of my problems just by getting promoted to the next level. So as an officer, I had a set of problems. If I got promoted to be the sergeant of something, then I could solve all of those problems, which is true. However, as you become a sergeant, you then inherit a larger, more complex set of problems. So this was the equivalent of drilling holes in the bottom of my boat to let the water out, and it didn't really work out all that well. And consequently, I have this little graph that shows my intended career path, my actual career path, and then the amount of alcohol I would consume on a given day. So this ended up culminating. The last 5 years I spent with the Naperville Police Department. I was Deputy Chief of Police, which was basically an office-bound job and of minimal entertainment value, but I was in charge of planning, training, research and development, and professional standards. So here's a candid photo, not at all staged for the annual report, of us actually doing emergency planning right there on the spot. So that's kind of what that is. But in the course of doing this, in the course of managing that job and managing emergency planning for the city of Naperville, nice little community of 140,000 people. Sometimes they kill each other, most times not. But we did have to do emergency planning. Law enforcement, no matter what the community, Chicago, Naperville, not so much. Risk, there's risk associated with doing the jobs. So in the course of going through my law enforcement career, I was introduced to a very handsome gentleman named Gordon Graham, who you've never heard of. Gordon Graham was a member of the California Highway Patrol in the late 70s and early 80s. You may know the California Highway Patrol from the very popular television show Chips. And we loved Chips. Gordon Graham in particular loved Chips. He was a highway patrolman in a squad car, not in a motorcycle. But during the filming of the Chips TV show, his district earned, they were assigned overtime shifts and overtime assignments to block off parts of the expressway for the filming of the show. Mr. Graham made so much money in overtime that he was able to put himself through law school. He obtained a law degree and ended up getting promoted repeatedly through the organization, ended up being in charge of the Office of Professional Standards for the California Highway Patrol. Fascinating guy, but he brought something unprecedented to the law enforcement community, and that is thinking about things in terms of risk management. And not just any kind of risk management. He would speak to us, he would do 4-day training sessions and talk to us about people like Admiral Hyman Rickover, who was basically known as the father of the nuclear Navy. This man was in charge as the head of naval reactors in the Navy for 30 years, to the point that he had just exacting standards and the highest standards and the most strictest adherence to rules and regulations, because if you blow up a nuclear submarine, it's kind of problematic. And this guy was responsible for making sure that wouldn't happen. He made it not happen by applying really strict risk management principles. And ultimately, it comes down to the fact that if you can predict something, you can prevent it. So his mantra was predictable is preventable. Here's a little risk management chart, just to explain risk management. The red X in the middle of the screen is the something terrible happened. And let's just say somebody sticks their arm in a wood chipper at the Arboretum. That's fairly terrible. We don't want that to have that happen at all. We try to avoid things like that. Once that happens, the only thing that we can really do is provide medical treatment, we'll pay out on a workers' comp claim for sure, there will be a lawsuit, but mostly we live in writing checks and arguing over how many zeros go on the check. This is the realm of lawyers, and it's called post-incident correction, and there's nothing we can do about it once the accident happens. Before the accident happens, though, we can apply risk management principles like planning, training, safety policies, nice things to have, and employee involvement. And we get out in front of the problems. We think about what could happen, and we actually do something about it before it happens, and that is risk management, and it's universally applicable. So in emergency planning, now that we're actually 12 minutes into this, and I'm going to start talking about emergency planning for cultural properties right now, maybe. So what do we worry about, and what should we be worrying about? And then once we actually figure that out, instead of worrying about it, what can we actually do about it? So I'm going to talk to you about risk and frequency. So a little chart and graph, just to liven things up a little bit. On the left side, we've got risk. I'm going to plot out some things. The higher you go on the chart, the more risky it is, the more dangerous it is. On the bottom axis, we're going to talk about frequency. Basically, how often do we deal with this? So we could plot out all the things that can go wrong. Day in, day out, catastrophic emergencies, minor annoyances, everything on there can fit onto this chart somewhere in terms of how often it happens and how bad it is. From not too bad and not often to really pretty horrible all the time. So let's chop this up into some quadrants. And when we think about what we should be worrying about, it shouldn't be everything. We can't worry about all of it. If we can, then we've got extra time on our hands, and that's kind of cool if you don't need to be here. If you have a limited amount of time and resources to aim at emergency planning, let me tell you, we should work on low risk stuff, not that, nothing to worry about. How about this stuff in the corner here? High risk, but also high frequency. I'm sure each of you can come up with examples in your own organization. For the Arboretum, I'll come up with slip, strips, and falls. It's an outdoor environment. We've got 100 million people coming through. It's a natural environment. People fall over, people get hurt. It happens. We have on-site medics, and we have a great relationship with the fire department. We've got ambulances coming and going from the place fairly often. We have 9 miles of road, so people want to ride their bicycles really fast, and when they do, they fall over. So this happens all the time, and it's risky, and it's problematic, but it happens so frequently that it's not really something our employees don't know how to handle. They've got it. It happens frequently. The brand new employees see how the more senior employees are doing it. They learn on the job. And overall, the process is managed. It may evolve over time, but it's not really the thing. The thing we really need to worry about, high risk and low frequency. Really high risk incidents that just never happen or happen infrequently. Those are the ones that really require some planning, some forethought, and some training. And I'm going to zoom in on that quadrant just a little bit. Not just high risk and low frequency, but let's talk about how much time you have available. Do you have discretionary time to work the problem, or is it absolute flat out right now emergency? I will say that, let's say you've got a high risk employee, an employee that has exhibited violent tendencies in the past. And today's the day we're going to fire that person. You have time to take a step back, get your people in order, maybe get some security on site, maybe notify the local police department that you're doing this. You have time to come up with a plan and get your resources in order to execute the plan. It's high risk. It does not happen that often, but if you have discretionary time to think about it and work on it, that's not a bad deal. Things where you have no discretionary time, things that are just flat out emergencies right here, right now, let's go, those are the things that really require some thought, some planning, some forethought, and some training so that people don't freak out. Yes, sir?
Got it.
Okay, got it. Okay, so what we do in terms of planning, when we have time to plan for emergencies, it's about adding the luxury of time to what we're doing. We have a chance to have some discussion of situational assessment. We can identify or develop new resources. We can have time to sit back and debate, and we get all this work together, and we do it all so that we can come up with a document that we can share with people and communicate. But we have to go back to that first quote. No battle plan really survives first contact with the enemy. Our plans have to be flexible. We have to build some flexibility that it would be impossible to prepare for every single situation, and we wouldn't want to anyhow. It would be cumbersome, it would be overcomplicated, and it wouldn't capture the level of agility and the situational awareness we would need to respond in a true crisis. And training in this manner would be detrimental. I'll go back to that FBI thing for just a second. So one of the problems that they had, this was kind of a watershed moment for the law enforcement community, the FBI got their butts kicked by 2 guys with automatic weapons. One of the issues is, if you think about the FBI and you visualize what their lives must be like, very rigid, very structured, and their training practices were so rigid and structured that when things went bad, they were not able to react in a dynamic environment. So one of the key issues is, it's a shootout. It's kind of a big thing. When they were in their training in the FBI range, they were told not to make a mess. Don't get your shell casings all over the place. Keep them nice and neat. These guys are in the middle of a shootout with bank robbers with automatic weapons, and after the scene was examined, the FBI agents were putting little shell casings in nice little neat piles. It's not the time to do it, but in high levels of stress, you fall back on how you're trained. So now training is very dynamic. Let people, when you come up with good ideas for emergency plans, give the flexibility to let people make decisions for themselves. Keep a primary objective in mind. Allow for the unexpected. And in fact, when you're training, create some unexpected if you can. If you're doing a fire drill, block one of the exits. Block one of the stairwells. Say, nope, this is fire here. Make people go to another exit. Make people understand that they have to be flexible and fluid in their response to an emergency. Flexibility is the key. Make sure you've got the right people in the right place. Line level supervisors are critical in this. Make sure they have resources, empower them to make good decisions, give them tools to communicate what they're doing with their radio, telephones, wide area communication means text messaging services. And if you can train your supervisors or your people who are leaders in the organization to exhibit calm in the face of emergency, calm is contagious. Being animated and psychotic and freaking out is also contagious. People are going to look to the leadership moment. Calm leadership in the face of crisis, they got it. So we talk about this in terms of all hazards planning with first responders, coordination with your local police and fire. Be good public safety customers. There are people in your communities working for the police and fire departments that want to work with you, that want to know more about what you're doing, and want to come up with good plans with you. So when we think about those little minor things, we think about the scariest things that could happen, and rather than just waking up in a cold sweat, we have the chance to talk about it in advance, come up with some options, and truly, I'm not going to skip ahead through a couple slides because I'm running out of time. Make sure your plans cover about 80% or 90% of what could happen, but leave some space for interpretation. Don't freak out now because you have time to analyze it now, and you can't stick your head in the sand. So that's a thing that I'm going to skip past here. So as we firm up the plan and you think about the bad things that happen, this is the spot where we talk about accessibility and when we talk about partnership with first responders. This is the time where you're thinking of the really truly bad scenarios and how we plan for them, rather than thinking of it in terms of, gosh, I really hope that doesn't happen. No. Let's have a plan. Let's think of every worst case scenario and let's at least address it. What resources do we need? What information do we need to communicate to our first responders? How do we firm this up? And keep it simple if at all possible. So once you've got a plan, communicate, over-communicate if you can. Tell your people, say it, have a meeting, send it by email, have a discussion. There's so many different channels of learning and channels that people are more responsive to sometimes. Repeat it, reinforce it, and don't stick with the bad plan. If you've got a plan and you try it out during some training and it's lousy, change it. It's your plan. You get to do whatever you're on with it, and it's a living document. So if your plans can cover fire, severe weather, one of the things we don't always think of is environmental threat. Hazard communication, trucks driving by, flips over, spills acid all over the place. It would affect your property conceivably. Come up with a plan for that. Low order of probability, but still something to prepare for. And then the one we really hate talking about is workplace violence. Where you've got something aimed at a specific employee, you've got an angry employee of your own that freaks out, or you have the other unthinkable and unmentionable things like active shooters. And active shooter comes down to having people have a calm response in the face of what is absolutely a worst case scenario crisis. And the thing that I would point you at if you want to learn a little bit more about that, the Department of Homeland Security puts together an active shooter how to respond brochure. There are video training materials, and each of you would have to gauge your organization's own capacity to grasp that material, deal with that material, and address it. Some of it's jarring and shocking, but it is one of those things that this is just part of the dynamic environment we're living in today. It merits some attention. So that is all I have for you today. Again, very nice to meet you all. Thank you for having me. Here's my email address and phone number. I guess you guys would get the PowerPoint later on if you wanted it. Thank you so much.
Introduce our next presenter, Sally Garrison, who's coming to be with us through Skype all the way from Captioning, Arizona. So that's we should give her a warm welcome and Xavier for the
Hi, everybody. So this is a little unusual for me. You guys are my very first Skype presentation. So bear with me a little bit. Normally in person, I'm one of those people who moves around the room a lot. So I'm going to count on you guys to still kind of feed me your energy, because I love playing to an audience, particularly when I'm talking about something so fantastic as the emergency evacuation plans for venues. But also, yeah, right, an exciting topic. But also, welcome from sunny Arizona. I wish I could be there with you in Chicago today. I'm sure the weather there is fantastic. Unfortunately, here it's only about 85 degrees today and sunny. So. I see daggers coming at me already. Okay, so with that, why don't we go ahead and jump into the presentation. So we're going to talk about venue evacuations. I know I have Mike doing slides for me. So we're going to start with the first slide, which is we're going to talk about just general questions that people should kind of think about. And these are just kind of a self-evaluation for you. So we're going to start, I want you guys to think about, as we go through this today, we're going to talk about all these things in the presentation, but what is your venue's evacuation plan? Do you have an evacuation plan? When was the last time it was reviewed? And for those of you who are grammar people like me, yes, I do. I realized this morning that I left the ED off the review, so go ahead and add that right now to your paper. It'll make me feel a little better. But think about the last time it was reviewed, or when was it last updated? Do all your staff have a role during the evacuation? Do they know what their job is during any kind of evacuation or any emergency situation? Have they been trained? How are they being trained? Are you actually, how, and really, and how often are they being trained? And then within that plan, are your patients with disabilities being included? All right, so we're going to jump to the next slide. We're going to talk about our goals for the day. And we've got three major ones that we're going to work on today. Because you guys are getting like the short version of this today, but you're still going to get a lot out of this, I promise. So your first goal that I have for today is we're going to define and discuss some basic evacuation terms. Just so that way we all have a knowledge base, because I know everybody in this room right now is at a different place in learning about and working with evacuation. So I want to make sure that we're all kind of on a level playing field, so we're going to talk about basic evacuation terms and those definitions. Then we're going to talk about the importance of trained staff, because trained staff, for those of you who have to answer to risk managers and lawyers and vice presidents and such, you're going to be able to go back to them and say, hey, this is why we should be training our staff, because they play a huge role. And I'm going to even give you some numbers that you can take back to the number crunchers within your organizations. And then we're going to talk about the best ways to integrate patrons who have disabilities within the plans for your facility. All right, so our very first evacuation term is going to be mapping, and this is something we all do. We do this naturally. And I can see some of you by a quick show of hands. How many of you take the same route to and from work almost every day? A few of you. I see a few hands going up there. Okay. And I saw a couple of half hands too. Don't worry, I saw you. But we naturally map how we're going to go through things. We do this even more so when we go someplace that we are unfamiliar with or we only go to on an occasional basis. So we naturally find our way in and out. We create those landmarks in our mind as to where we parked our car, how we came in, and things like that. It's a perfectly natural thing, but in emergency situations, it's probably not the best thing. Once you start doing this and start working with your staff, I can almost guarantee that every single one of you will start walking into rooms and will start looking around and just mentally to yourself going, I can exit here, I can go over there, and you'll start doing this. But you'll also start recognizing when you're mapping as well. So our next slide are wayfinding aids. And wayfinding aids are just those simple things that help us find our way around a space. They can be visual clues, they can be physical, they may be audio, but they tell us how to move from point A to point B in either the quickest manner, in the most delightful manner, whatever it is, but they help us get around and find the things that we need. Now, there are lots of different types of wayfinding aids. We're going to jump to that next slide, Mike. For types of wayfinding aids, they can be something as simple as signs. We see signs all the time, and most of us being venue people, we actually read signs, which comes in handy. Lights are also another type of wayfinding aid because they will guide, and they actually create lights. Lights a lot of times actually create a line from one point to another and will guide us to doors. Airplanes are a great example of lights as a wayfinding aid because the flight attendants tell us where they show us where our exit doors are, but they also usually tell us that there are lights down on the floor that will point our way to the nearest exit door. So lights are an important wayfinding aid as well. Our staff is another great wayfinding aid because they're the folks who are going to actually physically be able to sometimes take patrons or guests to a specific spot, or they know what to do, good hand gestures and point out where things are. Maps are another natural wayfinding aid, and sometimes in the fancier places, you'll have good audio, you can have audio programs that will help people find their way around. So going to the next slide, these are just some pictures and examples of different wayfinding aids and talking and understanding, the type of information that they convey to us. They can tell us where the restrooms are, where our gate is at the airport, where the nearest exit is, where accessible services are, if we should be stopping or going, how to get in, what services are available at the next exit, right turn, left turn, no smoking, and most importantly, whether we should be running with scissors or not, right? All right, let's go on to our next definition, which is area of refuge. And not every building has areas of refuge. Some of you may have what are known as safe havens. They may be temporary, they may be permanent. But an area of refuge, by definition, is a location in a building that can hold occupants in a safe place during an emergency. And the most important thing about an area of refuge is it must have permanent two-way communication. This can be a telephone, it can be an intercom system, but it has to be permanent two-way communication. Now, if it's an intercom system, one of the best things you should do every once in a while is to just go through and double check to make sure those intercoms are still working and find out who they call. Because sometimes, particularly if you've had some construction in the building at any point in time, sometimes those lines get mispatched or something like that. So always do, just every once in a while, go through and just double check that two-way communication. Now, bouncing off area of refuge to the next slide is an accessible area of refuge. And this is exactly the same as their standard area of refuge. It has to have the standard two-way communication. It's a safe place in an emergency. But it needs to have at least 48 inches of space between either the wall or the handrails so that you can move someone who uses a mobility device, whether it be a wheelchair, a scooter, or walker, or maybe somebody who's on crutches. They can be moved to this spot either to wait until the major flow of people has gone by or until first responders can arrive, so that other people can also still continue safely by them down the stairs or wherever this route happens to be. Very commonly, areas of refuge, and Mike, we're going to jump to that next slide right now. Common areas of refuge are stairwells. In hospitals, it may be a control room or an operating room. Theaters is a control room. But again, they're usually going to be marked. They also have to be marked, and again, that permanent two-way communication. All right. Our next that we're going to talk about on the next slide is going to be a pre-event checklist. And this is just a handy tool that everybody on your staff should have. If you're in a theater, your house manager should have one, your usher should have one. If you're in a museum, your docent should have one. And this is just a checklist that they should go through before they open the doors for any event or at the start of business each day. And it just helps make sure that things are ready and safe. It can include things like, unlock doors, check to make sure the programs are ready, make sure nothing is blocking doors, make sure that flashlights have batteries, radios are working, and list of items that need to be reported that need repair or touching up or something like that, or something needs to be cleaned up. So that pre-event checklist is just a nice tool to have to help make sure that common hazards and things are put away, but also gives you a chance to take a walk around the space to make sure that there aren't other things in the way, or something that's a little bit out of place that shouldn't be there that might need to be called in. Okay, so we're going to jump down to our next slide. So we're going to start talking about those trained staff members, and this is where the information that you can take back to those risk managers and those lawyers within your organization. They'll think you are the most brilliant person in the world if you start bringing some of this information back to them. So why are our trained staff important? So going to that next slide, they do a lot of important things, but three of the main things that our trained staff do is they help primarily to reduce vulnerability, and we're going to talk a little more in depth about vulnerability in just a few moments. But they reduce our vulnerability by being knowledgeable, being aware of the circumstances, and just knowing the building. They help control situations, whether it's a patron who's grumpy because they don't have a program, or hey, there's a spill on the floor, and they're making sure. Or maintenance is being, or evacuation, to help control the flow of people outdoors. They also react quickly and appropriately, as well as reasonably and responsibly. And that's very important for your trained staff. You want them to do all of those things. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about, this is where we go a little more in depth about vulnerability. So somebody a long time ago, way smarter than me, broke down risk and figured out that you could actually put risk into a mathematical formula, which you can tell is way smarter than me because I'm in the arts for a reason. I don't do math. I do as little math as possible. But risk, they broke it down into three parts. It's threat, vulnerability, and consequences. Now, three of these three things, we can only control vulnerability. Threat can be, but let me break this down just a little bit. Threat can be, almost anything. That can be a person, that can be an action, that can be a location. There's very little that we can do about natural threat. Consequence, that's the aftermath of what has happened. So again, consequence is something we don't have control over what happens in the aftermath. But vulnerability, we can reduce our vulnerability. So you can, by training our staff, is one of the best ways to reduce your vulnerability. And so that's one of the first things that you tell those risk managers, hey, why do we need to do more training? Why are we spending more money? Because we're going to reduce our vulnerability so we can reduce the amount of risk that we have. So go to the next slide. How do we reduce vulnerability? Well, first of all, we are going to make sure that we as managers and that understand our facilities procedures, but then we're going to pass that on to our team members. And we're going to make sure that they understand all of our procedures, our policies. How do we do things day in and day out? We want to make sure that they get what we're doing, whether from the customer service aspect, the safety aspect. We want to make sure that they understand our procedures. We want to make sure that we're performing all those tasks that need to happen, whether it's a pre-show task, a during the day task, and at the end of the day task, our boxes being put away, our carts being put away, just all those little things that need to happen. Are we being vigilant? Are we paying attention to what's happening each day? Now, and when something happens, we want to make sure we're responding quickly, reasonably, responsibly, and appropriately in a variety of situations. And we want to make sure that we're taking part in regular training and refresher courses. I'm going to tell a quick story here. I have staff that are very much I'm a trainer, and so we go through regular training here at least 3 times a year with the front of house staff. And they all roll their eyes at me, and there's teams, some of them will probably roll your eyes at you too if you become as vigorous about training as I am. And so I get lots of eye rolling. But we had an incident here recently. It was a medical emergency, and one of our own team members had a heart attack. And it was amazing to see the team here just fly right into action. They didn't think twice about what was happening, what was going on. Everyone did their jobs. They reacted exactly the way they had been trained to do. And the great part of the story is that team member who had the heart attack is back working with us again about 2 months after the incident happened. So, and it was right after that they all were like, oh my gosh, Sally, now we understand, now we get it. One of the biggest eye rollers was the guy who had the heart attack, and he's the first one now to say, when are we doing the next training? So, he was really big on, hey, when are we doing that next CPR training, which we just did. So that regular training by your staff, it really does help. Okay, so let's jump on to the next slide. And these are, again, our training staff, they also help control situations. One of my biggest red flags for somebody, and this happens a lot with new people or people who haven't been through training enough for me yet, is when you have that staff member who's like, gosh, I love working here because I love seeing the shows, or I love looking at the exhibits. We all have at least one of those people. But the trick with that is if they're paying more attention to the shows and the exhibits, then they aren't paying attention to what else is going on around them. So we need our staff, we want to go through training so we can make sure that they are alert and aware of what's going on around them in all aspects. They should be, the theater staff here, I tell them that their job is, the show that they are watching is called The Audience. It's the same show day in and day out, but it's a fascinating show, The Audience, and that's what they should be doing. Now, if they take a quick commercial break and watch the show on the stage, whatever that happens to be, that's okay. But their primary job is to be aware of what's going on within the audience chamber. Our folks who are in the lobby, the same thing. The TV show they're watching is called The Lobby, and so on and so forth. But you want to make sure that your staff is aware of what's going on. And part of by making them aware and teaching them and empowering them to be aware is that they're going to pick up on those things that are just a little bit out of sync much quicker. You also want to make sure that they communicate well. And part of that is being able to give good directions, communicating with each other in situations. But the key part of that is also making sure that they know how to actively listen and follow directions as well, because communication is definitely a two-way street. And then the third thing that they do in controlling situations is their demeanor. And if you've got that staff member who in an emergency situation is looking around going, and they're flying back and forth, and they remind you a little bit of a cartoon character, that's not the best demeanor that you want presented to people in an emergency situation. You want them to pull on that Zen mode and focus in and be like, I got this, people. Just, it's okay, hold on to your socks, I got this covered. So, demeanor is really important. So going on to the next slide. You also want your staff to react quickly and appropriately. They need to know what has to happen. So by going through training, they are going to know how to react. Whether it's a small child who has tripped and fallen and just needs a Band-Aid, to, hey, that fire alarm's going off, we need to start getting people out of here, or, oh my gosh, there's a flood in the bar, we gotta keep people out of the bar. And I know it's tough sometimes to keep people out of a bar, but you can do it. I know you can if you ever have to. They also react well at giving directions, and that may be, and that's not just directions to, hey, use this door over here to get out, but they might be giving directions to fellow team members, saying, hey, if you can take this group of people, I'll go help these folks over here, or hey, I know that you're really good at this, why don't you go take care of this aspect and I'll finish up this part of the task. So giving directions to each other as well as to your guests. but again, they're going to do that very calmly and happily. They're going to always remain calm and zen. They're going to look like, even if they don't know what they're doing, they're going to look like they know what they're doing. Again, tell them to put on that zen game face and just breathe deeply, because when your staff is calm, everything else works much better, and things happen much quicker and much more safely. So we're going to jump to the next slide. Now, this is the slide that where you guys can crunch numbers and show this to your risk managers. This is the doom and gloom part of the presentation. And if you ever have seen the full presentation of this, you know there's a lot more of this. But for today, I'm going to keep this as simple as possible. So, in all three of these situations are fires that happen in different areas. Two of them here in the United States, one in the United Kingdom. And I used fires just to keep everything on a level playing field. So the first one is one that some of you may remember. This just happened back in 2001, if I remember correctly. This was the Station nightclub in Rhode Island. The situation there was they were in an overcrowded club. They were actually almost twice their regular capacity, at about 460 people. They had a fire that broke out because of pyrotechnics on the stage. And the unfortunate aftermath in that case is that they had no trained staff. None of the staff members at that club knew what to do in emergency, so none of them reacted. About 100 people in that fire, which was, as you can see by the numbers there, almost 22% of the people in the club. Almost half of the people who were there had some type of reportable injury. So that's kind of one of those things that happens when you don't have trained staff. So it's important to spend those dollars and that time training staff. Even if you only train one staff member, as you look at the next one, the Beverly Hills Supper Club in Kentucky, which happened in the 70s. How many of you remember John Davidson? One or two of you maybe? John Davidson? I see a lot of heads shaking going, John Davidson? I remember him more as a game show host, but apparently he was a lounge singer for a while too. But John Davidson was performing at the Beverly Hills Supper Club in the 70s. This took place in Kentucky. Again, it was a case of a building being at over capacity. They were well over twice their capacity that night in Kentucky. Or not the whole state, just the supper club. The fire broke out there. One staff member, an 18-year-old busboy. Now, whether he was actually trained or he just knew how to react in an emergency, that I've never been able to find out. But one person reacted, took the mic right out of the performer's hand, and started giving directions to the exits. 165 people died, but as you can see, the difference in percentage of what happens when just one person reacts reasonably and responsibly and starts giving directions. That number drops to 5.2%. Again, over 200 people were injured, but you can see that percentage drop again. It's only 6.3%. Now, the last example there is Bradford Stadium. That's in England. It was a soccer match, and a fire broke out in the grandstands. There were over 11,000 people in the stands that day. Now, if you ever get a chance, there's actually a fantastic video of the Bradford Stadium fire, and I love Brits. Because at one point the police and these 22 spectators who were helping evacuate people, they were sending people onto the soccer field. And you can see the video where all these people are celebrating and cheering the fire on. But the great thing is, most of them got to cheer on the fire, but it's kind of strange to watch them do that. So, but jumping back to the numbers, 11,000 people in the stands, 56 people died that day, which very sad, but percentage-wise, because all of the police officers who were there and 22 spectators who I'm very convinced were ushers or venue managers all reacted, again, that percentage just plummets. The number of injured also drops again. So this is if you ever need a visual example to give somebody to prove how important training your staff is, this is a great example to give. Feel free to use this anytime. Okay, moving on. We're going to talk about who is part of your evacuation team. Hopefully the answer that all of you are thinking right now is, well, everybody in our building is part of the evacuation team. All right, so we're going to jump to that next slide. And your evacuation team, who can be part of your evacuation team? Pretty much everyone should have some kind of job. All of your front of house folks, whether they work in a box office, they're ushers, docents, ticket takers, they're house managers, whatever their job is, they should all have some type of job. Anybody who works in the back of house, from production to curators to maintenance staff, technicians, again, should have some type of job to do. Your administrative staff have some tasks to do that day. And one of the things that we do here is we have a point of contact, which we call evacuation commander. And Mike, if you can go to that next slide. And the role of that point of contact, or evacuation commander, or whatever you want to call them, is they are the person who, when there's an emergency, they are the person that everyone will report to, everyone within the building reports to let them know what's going on, what's happening in their area, are they clear or whatnot. Then that point of contact disseminates that information to first responders as they arrive. Now, so basically they're coordinating all the response efforts. So they're calling out and saying, hey, I want you to call out to me, tell me what's going on. They're receiving all those reports and just kind of making sure everything is rounded up and tied up into a neat little package at the end of the day. Now, an important thing to point out is that you may have, depending on your venue, you may have a different point of contact every single day. You may have the same person as the point of contact during the week, but it might change on weekends. Other facilities, that point of contact changes throughout the day. So it just kind of depends on how you create your plan and what roles people have. Jumping down to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about crowd movement in evacuation situations. And the basics of crowd movement is just getting people to move to where you want them to go to. So the first thing we're going to talk about on the next slide is safe evacuation time versus required evacuation time. It's important to know how much time you have in your building versus how much time you're going to need to get out. You always want to need less time than you have. So if you know that your building is rated so that you have 7 minutes, you want to practice with your staff on being able to get people out within 5 minutes. So that you always have that little cushion. Folks, sometimes in different places, some people will call it R set versus A set, so required versus available. All right, so what types of evacuation are there? We're going to go to that next slide. Types of evacuation, there's limited, directed, and general. And I'm going to give you the definitions for all three of those starting right now. So the first one is limited evacuation. And that should have its own slide. That's redirecting people from a specific area to a whole new location to avoid a hazard. So what do we mean by a limited evacuation? The best example is say you have a restroom that has a pipe has burst and you have restrooms that are flooded and you need to get people, number one, you have to evacuate people from that restroom, but now you need to redirect folks to another restroom. So that's what a limited evacuation is. You're just keeping people away from a specific hazard. Usually it's a temporary hazard. You can also, sometimes a limited evacuation may be bringing people in from a specific weather condition. You might have, where we're located here in Tempe, we have a park right next to us. And occasionally during monsoon season, we get these microbursts that come out pretty quick and people may be out in the park, jogging or whatever, and we will invite them to come in so that they can get in and out of that weather and away from the storm danger until it goes by. So that's a limited evacuation. On the next slide, we have a directed evacuation. It's very similar to limited, but in this case, you're going to exit people along a very specific route. You're going you're guiding them away from a potential threat. And in this case, it could be a lot of things. It could be a suspicious package, it could be an active shooter, but you're going to use very specific areas so that you're completely avoiding that threat. On the next slide is general evacuation. And all of us, and anyone who works in a venue practices general evacuation at the end of every day when you're getting ready to lock up and you're telling people, thank you so much, please come back again tomorrow, and you're locking the doors. You're using every single available exit that you have to help people exit. And a general evacuation in an emergency situation can be the exact same thing. You're using every available door to get people back out to safe areas, like parking lots or parks or whatever. Okay, on the next slide. Initiation of movement. This is probably the hardest part of evacuating any facility, because we've gotten so used to hearing alarms and things in our lives that we can hear an alarm go off, and we're all guilty of this. We'll kind of hear it, we look up, what? Oh, is that an alarm? Okay, and we'll stay in our seats, or we'll continue shopping or whatnot, whatever it is we happen to be doing. We kind of tend to ignore those alarms these days. So it's important that your staff be trained on how to convince people to get up and start moving. So again, we're going back to the remain calm. They're going to make themselves visible. I tell people, make yourself big. If it means opening your arms wide, standing on your tiptoes, make yourself visible. Use your big outside voice. You're going to communicate with folks that, hey, there's an emergency happening in the building, so you're going to give them direction as to what you want them to do. Even if sometimes starting as basic as, ladies and gentlemen, we need to have everyone please stand up, turn to the left, and begin exiting through your nearest doors. So break it down by giving good directions, by using good non-verbal signals, because you never know who's in your audience. You may have a patron who is deaf or hard of hearing that day. So using visual, non-verbal cues is also important as well. Using your hands to give directions and to help show which doors are available, things like that. So practicing all of those things is also very important. And to quote one of my favorite basketball coaches, always remember that slower is faster. With the initiation of movement, it does not have to, it needs to start immediately, but it does not have to be super crazy fast. And you don't want people running to doors, because if you have people moving calmly, you're going to clear your building out much quicker rather than if they're trying to run towards exits, because that's when people start tripping and things like that, and then it creates more hazards. All right, so moving on to the slide. I think, Mike, I forgot to tell you to move slides. We're going to move to the slide that says patrons with disabilities. And this is just the question of how do we include patrons with disabilities in the evacuation process. And this is one of these things that I think a lot of folks think about or just take for granted and think, well, it's part of the building and we just do it. But a lot of venues don't actually have actual written directions. So if you have a new person, if you have wanted, what I like to ask people is, if you want on a trip around the world and you get to be in the office for 90 days, I might never come back personally, but if you get a chance to be with in the office for 90 days, you need to put somebody else in charge. And they may need to train a new person while you're gone. So you want to make sure that they have all the tools available. And so you want to make sure that patients with disabilities are included in those written documents. So going to the next slide, we're going to talk about the written evacuation plan. So this is where you can start reviewing your facility's emergency procedures. And go through them with a fine-tooth comb. Who's mentioned in them? Are patients with disabilities mentioned with them? Are specific groups of folks mentioned in them? Because a lot of times I see great evacuation plans, but they only discuss patrons with mobility who use mobility devices. They don't talk about what do we do? How do we train our staff for patrons who may be blind, or patrons who may have low vision, or patrons who may be deaf or hard of hearing. We want to make sure that as many disabilities as possible are included in there, so that number one, you can remember to train for those situations, but also so that your staff is always aware of the patrons that may be in the facility during an emergency. On the next slide, one of the most important things is walking the routes. And this is one of the things when I first started doing this, and actually this is how I kind of got into this is I had a patron who came to our facility, and I'm in a fairly new facility here in Tempe, and I had a woman who uses a wheelchair, and she's just a tiny woman in general, and her wheelchair was a little bit lower than some, and because of that, her pivot point was lower. Well, one of our doors that leads to and from one of our accessible seating areas, because of her lower reach, was very difficult for her to open. And thankfully she discovered this during the intermission of the show rather than during an emergency. But she took the time to call me the very next day and say, "Hey, can I talk to you about this? And this is what my concern is." Well, it was something that a lot of us hadn't thought about. We knew that somebody in a standard wheelchair could open the door, but what about somebody who was in something that lower? So I had invited her to come down, and we walked routes together to find out which ones were the most accessible for her, as someone using a mobility device. Where was vertical movement required? And that vertical movement is anything where you need to move up or down. As a quick tip, for vertical movement, downward is the most dangerous because of gravity, because gravity is the law after all. Which routes do we have safe havens? We don't have areas of refuge here at my current facility, just because of some different design features. But we do have temporary safe havens. But which areas along those routes have these safe havens or areas of refuge? And then once I did all this walking with her and kind of discovering different things, that I would make notes, and then I went and took the notes to my supervisor, and we talked about how we could plan things and discuss this with the staff. And then of course we practice a lot, and we started doing this for all sorts of situations. We have one of our partner groups here at TCA who does a lot of work with autistic children. And so that's sometimes a whole different challenge working with folks on the spectrum, because we need to really look at different other routes and other types of plans and areas of refuge and such for people with autism. All right, moving on to that next slide. Is getting community input. Just like I was saying, I spoke to, the woman's name is Bonnie. And so I spoke with her, and after talking with her, I realized I needed to bring in some other folks. So if you know that you happen to have a large community of folks with, maybe a large community of folks who are deaf nearby who frequent your facility, get some of them to come in and say, "Hey, you know what? We're looking at our evacuation plans. Can you help us, determine what's going to be best for folks who are deaf?" Bring somebody in who's blind or has low vision and talk to them as well. Bring in parents of autistic kids. Get their input. Find out what they like about your facility in terms of evacuation and procedures. Find out what their concerns are. And and as you work these routes and things like that, have them join you on these walks, because they're going to give you just amazingly invaluable input on all of those. So going to the next slide, we're going to talk about an action plan. And your action plan is, number one, is determining the best time to move folks who may be using a mobility device. Because sometimes you may send them out first, sometimes you may send them out about midway through, sometimes you may have them go out last. This could just depend on where they are in your facility, what the rest of the crowd looks like, how fast can they go, and how fast can they start their initiation of movement. So you're going to determine those plans, you're going to practice those kinds of things. And you're going to communicate, you're going to work on clear communication. Again, working on those verbal and nonverbal directions with your staff. I have some staff members that are amazing actors, and they can get up there and they can give fantastic verbal directions, but as soon as I tell them they need to communicate everything without using any words, they don't know what to do. So it's good to practice both those verbal and nonverbal communication devices as part of that action plan. And then if people have come with companions who are able to assist, always, always, always feel free to ask them if they can and are willing to help in an evacuation. Most of the time they are going to say yes. If they say no, you might want to give them a little head nod and say, "What?" Now, they may have a good reason for that. They might be looking for the insurance money. You never know. So, but do ask those companions to assist. Like I said, most of the time they're going to absolutely say yes. And then when and where possible, if you have folks that you cannot move at that time and you know it may be a few moments before you can get them initiated, and get that movement initiated, have staff member stay with them. Or if you can't, stay with them until you can get them going, because that's going to keep them calm, and they are going to know that, hey, I might not be leaving right now, but they care enough to leave somebody with me, and they're going to make sure I stay as safe as possible. All right, on that next slide, engaging patients with disabilities. A lot of us have regular visitors, season ticket holders, et cetera, and so it's important, really, when you see these familiar faces, if you have never taken the time to introduce yourself and say, hey, by the way, my name is Sally, and I'm one of the managers here. It's so great to see you. It's always nice to have you here. Take a moment to do that. Have your ushers and anybody who's there on a regular basis do the same thing. Just make sure they know folks, because number one, it's just that nice little extra bit of customer service, number one, but it's also just kind of a nice thing. So introduce yourself, and if you have some of those key staff members who are hanging out that day, say, hey, by the way, have you met so-and-so? They're one of our curators for our gallery space. Or hey, have you met this person here? They're one of our regular house managers. You should meet her, or you should meet him. So make sure you're doing those introductions as well. Because the other thing that's going to do is they're going to think that you're the best thing since sliced bread because you have time to say hello to them. On the next slide, again, just sticking with the same topic, is as you have folks who either are regular patrons or somebody who's maybe brand new to the area who comes in, maybe ask them, hey, would you like to have some information about what our seating areas look like? Are you looking or just the facility itself? Describe some of the accessible features that you may have there. Particularly if you have something really cool. I don't have anything super cool here except for LOL. Again, you guys are in Chicago, you know those. The venue I used to work at had an elevator joke that only went down, and so when I moved over here, I would brag to all my folks over at Gamma, I have an elevator that goes up and down here. So that's not the coolest thing I have. It's not, for me, it's exciting compared to my old venue. But describe those accessible features that you have. And talk about all the general things that you would with any other patron, what the distance and the view is like from the stage, where restrooms, drinking fountains, concession stands are, smoking areas, all the things, anything that we normally talk to any other patron about. But if you have guests with disabilities, feel free to give them that little bit of extra information as well. Maybe, what other services you provide. Oh, did you know that we have audio description? Oh yeah, be sure to tell your friends. Oh, we also have assisted listening devices. Am I back? Was that boring? Sorry, I'm much better in print, I swear. Okay, so somebody help me out. What was when did you guys lose me?
Concessions.
Concessions. Oh my gosh, now I don't know what I said after that. Let me jump back here. Okay, concession stands. Did you hear me talk about, I don't even know where I was. I'm going to jump to the next slide. We're going to talk about reviewing basic evacuation processes. I promise I didn't say anything too funny or entertaining. So we're going to jump to, engaging patrons with disabilities and reviewing basic evacuation processes. So you can always, I'm a little off my game now, sorry. Okay, and action, take two. So we're going to talk about means of egress. So you can have folks, sometimes if you have a busy night, feel free to, engage with people and say, hey, is this your first time here? Okay, great. And ask them, would you like to know about our evacuation process here? And if they say yes, go ahead and tell them what the egress plans are for the area that they're in, what the alternate routes are, and be sure to say, hey, by the way, this is the person who's going to be in this area tonight, or this is the person who's in this gallery today, and if you have any questions, be sure to let them know. And give them the locations of accessible areas of refuge or safe havens, or just any other kind of information that you think is going to be helpful for them. Oh, and here's the exciting part, the very next slide. Does anybody have questions? Fabulous. So do I have Rachel or Mike or anybody? Do I have time to take some questions, or are you guys ready for your next speaker?
We have time for questions.
Yes, yeah, we can do a couple of questions here.
Okay. Shout them out to me.
Hi, I'm Peter Williams with Chicago Children's Museum. Thank you very much. You described areas of refuge, but you said you didn't have some of those at your place, but you have temporary safe havens. What makes up a temporary safe haven?
Hi, Peter, by the way, and thank you for saying your name. I appreciate that. And Chicago's Children's Museum, that's one of those places that's still on my bucket list of places to go. So, temporary safe havens. What we use here, we have a couple of different places that we use here. But common things that venues use might be restrooms, particularly if you have restrooms that have tile floors. Stairwells are often good areas of refuge, temporary refuge. We happen to have here an outdoor terrace that is accessible. And obviously we have the advantage of being in Arizona, so we can use that outdoor terrace almost year round. Even in the summertime, but then we'll at least try to get them in the shade. So just it's one of those things that just kind of walk around and look at what you might be able to use. You may also be able to use an auxiliary control room if you're in a theater. At a museum, you may have a storage, actually you may have, a storage room or a loading dock that may have its own separate air ventilation system, and actually that's really fantastic. So just kind of walk around your venues and look at those spaces that you might have that are on the same level where you may have mobility devices, whether it's crutches, a scooter, whatever. Patrons who are using that you can take them to. That is basically a concrete-based kind of thing. You just want to make sure it's an area where there's few flammables as humanly possible. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Who else has a question?
Hi, my name is Alyssa Baum. I'm from the Old Town School of Folk Music. Are there recommendations or standards for how many people you should have on staff per the number of patrons that you have in the building?
Yes, National Fire Safety Standard book. The most recent, if I remember correctly, and I will have to admit I haven't looked this up in about a year, but the National Fire Safety Standard is 1 staff member per 200 people. And Alyssa, thank you for saying your name as well. I was paying attention. And as a matter of fact, the National Fire Safety Standard book, that's a great book. It's a little pricey, but you can get an online version of it now, or you can get the old-fashioned doorstop type book. But it's got so much amazing information in that book that is well worth the investment. Next question.
Anybody else have a question? Peter again?
Hi, this is Peter again. I wondered, we're in a multi-story facility. Do you have evacuation chairs? Are they required? Do you recommend them for multi-story facilities?
This is funny, you're the second person this week to ask me that question. I was just talking to Jennifer Berry over at the Lincoln Center earlier this week, and we were talking about evacuation chairs. We do not use evacuation chairs here. Partly just because they can be quite cost prohibitive. It also takes a fair amount of training to use them. They can also be quite bulky and unwieldy. The other trick with some of them is that you actually have to take the person out of and away from their whatever they have to be using. You might have to take them out of their wheelchair or their scooter or whatever. You move them out, and if you have to use that evacuation chair for somebody else, then now you have to take them out and just kind of either put them on a bench or on the ground. So you're really kind of taking them away from their form of, from basically what they're using as their legs. So I'm not a huge fan of having them on site. They're kind of, some fire departments have them and will bring them along because they're better trained at using them. I'd say let the firefighters use them if at all possible. The other part of that too is part of the reason why, and you'll see a lot of venues going away from the evacuation chairs, and that's because about 3 years ago, National Fire Safety Standards made a change in their elevator policies. Because a lot of elevators, I know, I can almost hear you go, what? Change in the elevator policies? A few years ago, because elevators are becoming, just like our phones, elevators are becoming smarter and smarter. And in newer facilities or facilities that have they've recently done some upgrades or have new elevators put in, so a lot of elevators now are being installed that have their own smoke detectors. And those interact with your fire panel. And so what will happen now with these newer elevators is those you'll see, it looks like a little speaker really on the outside of the elevator. And there's a speaker built into it as well, but there's also a smoke detector there. And what it does is it figures out how much smoke has come into that. And you are able to use that elevator until that smoke detector says, oh, no, I've had too much smoke, and then it will automatically recall itself to the first floor and stop working until the fire department arrives. So what they're saying is you can actually use elevators now until they automatically recall back to the first floor. And so that's kind of one of those handy dandy things to know now. Like I said, once that elevator gets recalled to the first floor, the only people who can use it is the fire department. I know that was pretty wordy for a simple yes or no question, wasn't it?
Thank you. I think one last question.
Hi, my name is Caitlin. I also work at the Old Town School of Folk Music. And I'm curious, you said you have about 3 trainings per year for your staff, which I'm sure include the fire practices and stuff. But do you require that your staff become CPR certified, or is that an optional thing for your staff?
I strongly encourage it. And actually, the great thing is, because I work for a city entity, the city is big on staff knowing CPR and how to also work AEDs, the automatic external defibrillators. So the city regularly offers free classes, but we've got a great rapport with our fire department, and so they will actually come over and do the classes, do the training for free for us. So we do have that advantage, and I would say honestly about 85% of our staff here currently are CPR certified, CPR, first aid, and AED certified. Training. So if you ever do that, I would say do it. I haven't made it mandatory yet, but like I said, it's mostly just because so many people just want to learn CPR for that opportunity to be able to have, and they all agree it's one of those skills they want to know, but hope they never have to use.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Shadi, for being here today.
Come harass all of you.
Today, thank you. And right now the slides with Sally, some contact information is up, so be sure to reach out to Sally with more questions. So finally, I would like to invite up presenter today, Jessica Mitchell from Prima.
My name is Jessica Mitchell. I'm a Disability Integration Specialist with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So I'm going to talk a little bit about accessible emergency preparedness for people with disabilities. And if you wouldn't mind helping me keep track of my time, I would really appreciate it. I tend to lose all track of it. So again, I'm going to start with a quote as well. Preparation through education is much less costly than learning through tragedy. I think we all know this. We need to not only think about the things that could happen in our facilities, in our communities, the barriers we might run into and prepare for those, but also train and review those drills and review those practices very often so that people know what to do when something happens and we can run into potential barriers or make some changes in a drill situation instead of in a real life event. So I'm going to skip through some of these really quickly. I think many of you know all of this, but I'm going to talk about preparedness for people with disabilities. So that includes all different disability types from mobility, cognitive and intellectual disability, mental health disabilities, hearing, vision, speech disabilities, and health maintenance disabilities. Another term, or first, disability facts. About 56 million Americans have some type of disability. 11 million people over the age of 6 need some type of assistance with activities of daily living. And one of the key things here is hidden disabilities and multiple disabilities. So you might not necessarily know when someone comes into your facility whether or not they have a disability, whether or not they might need some type of assistance during evacuation or during an emergency. And someone who has a visible disability might also have a hidden disability. So people might have multiple different types of needs. You'll also hear me use the term access and functional need quite a bit. The way we define this definition is a little bit confusing, but the way we define this is someone who may or may not meet the legal definition of having a disability, but they're going to need some additional support or assistance when something happens. So someone who doesn't speak English, doesn't have a disability, but they might need information in another language so that they can take the appropriate actions to keep themselves safe. Someone who has asthma that is well controlled on a daily basis, if there's a fire, that might create a barrier for them. They might need some assistance getting downstairs, walking a long period to get to a safe place. So when I talk about access or functional needs, that could be someone who has a disability. It might also be someone who has some medical needs, seniors, people that just aren't able to navigate the building to be able to get to a safer place. And some of the areas of consideration for people with access and functional needs and people with disabilities. When we think about people with disabilities, 56 million people in America, lots of different disability types, lots of different diagnoses. So a lot of times I get questions about, well, you know, if there are all of these differences and even differences in support needs between people with the same disability type. So someone who grew up deaf, grew up with sign language as their first language is going to have very different communication needs than someone who became deaf at a later age and is very comfortable with text-based information. So even people within the same disability type may have some very different needs. So one way to think about this is an acronym, CMIST, C-M-I-S-T. So how are people going to communicate? How are they going to maintain their health and independence? Safety, support services, and self-determination, and then transportation. If people need to get to a completely other area than your facility, how does that happen? So within these areas of consideration, that kind of covers a lot of what people are going to need and what types of assistance people might need during an emergency. I'm glad that both of the other presenters mentioned this. I think it's very important. Planning, knowing your role during and after an emergency. So some facilities, Their responsibility is for making sure their visitors and their staff remain safe. Other facilities might also have some other emergency management roles. So maybe they are serving as warming or cooling centers. Maybe they are serving as places where people can come and get information about a disaster or emergency that's happening. So know the role your community might play and tailor the plan to reflect that role. Have an accessible emergency plan for your employees and visitors. Communicate that plan to your visitors in as many ways as you can. It's very helpful for people to see this information before they need it, or at least know where they can go to get this type of information. And include people with disabilities in the planning process. Like the last presenter said, there's so many times where we go to a location or a facility that is, completely accessible, and maybe the facility itself is, but trying to get to that facility from public transportation that lots of people with disabilities use to get there is difficult. So then if they have to leave quickly, being able to get back to that public transportation. So include people with disabilities, know what their needs are, know some of the ways that those needs can be met in an efficient fashion. So one example that I like to give of this, one of the first trainings that I did in my current role, I was working with a group of AmeriCorps members, and they were all talking about accessible emergency shelters and what you can do to make shelters more accessible. And there was a young man who had a physical disability, who used a wheelchair, who was in one of the groups. And they were all discussing all of these different facts about the building that were potentially inaccessible for people and what they would do if they ran into that situation. The group who had the gentleman who used a wheelchair in their group was talking about water fountains that were too high for someone who was using a wheelchair to use. And so I'm kind of walking around listening to everyone, and all of the other people in that group are saying things like, well, we could build a ramp up to the water fountain. We need to pull the water fountain out and install another one that's lower. And finally, the guy said, can I just get a cup? Can I just get a bottle of water? So people with disabilities are great partners in planning for accessible evacuation and can let you know what works well and what is maybe easier and better during that planning process. So it's very important that people with disabilities are included, and including actual people with disabilities in exercises and drills. We've also seen situations where people come out to participate in an emergency drill and they have a shirt on that says, I have a mobility disability, or I am blind. You're not really getting the information you need from that type of a drill, because someone who is not actually blind is not going to know the resources that they use on a daily basis, or run into the same barriers that someone who is actually blind. So recruiting people with disabilities to participate in planning and exercise activities. Great partners are your Centers for Independent Living, self-advocacy groups, disability-specific groups. One thing you need to think about is communication. So if something happens, how do you let people know that an emergency is going on? So you want to provide information in multiple formats: visually, verbally, tactile information like you saw in the previous presentation. And they need to know what type of an emergency it is. So I think we're all aware of the flashing strobe lights on fire alarms to alert people who are deaf or hard of hearing. What happens if you're using that same alarm system to alert people that they need to shelter in place because there's bad weather outside? So if people don't know whether they need to go down to the first floor of the building or get out and get as far away from the building as possible, that's not going to be as helpful. So having a way to denote the type of emergency, and using equipment you already have. If you have equipment that gives people who are blind access to your programs and your facility, is there a way that you can tap into that for emergency messages? One example I was thinking of, I know Some places have started using apps on your smartphone to describe the different, it's the end of the day and I'm blanking on all of my words. So to describe the different things that people can see throughout your facility, is there a way that you can use that to send an emergency alert to people who are using that app when something happens? So using equipment you already have, and then having redundant and low-tech backup procedures. So redundant, of course, means you have multiple ways of getting that message out there, and low-tech would be something like in an evacuation, when you have staff going through making sure everyone's out of the building or everyone has gone down to the area of refuge, have them hold a sign that has some basic symbols that says either evacuate or shelter in place as they're going around. So if they encounter someone who is deaf, maybe someone who English is not their first language, they can still get some of that information through that signage. And then use employees to spread the message. I'm also a huge proponent of training employees how to interact with people with disabilities, especially in an emergency situation. So if there is someone who looks confused, making sure that they know to ask first, to ask what is going to help that individual the most, that they're not going to run up to someone who is blind and grab their coat sleeve and say, we need to run this way and start running. Just train employees on the best ways to work with people with disabilities to let them know that an emergency is happening and what they can do to best protect themselves. For facility evacuation, you're going to want to have accessible signage for evacuation routes. You're going to want to have accessible routes to evacuation areas. That may include evacuation chairs. I know there was a question about that earlier. In our facility, so there's not a law, at least in the Chicago area, that says that you have to have evacuation chairs in your facility as long as you have those areas of refuge with a two-way communication and all of that. In our facility, we decided to go ahead and get those. We have a number of staff that are trained on how to use them because we were made aware of a few situations where it was difficult to get to people quickly and where the threat inside the building was significant enough that people really needed to get out. So if there is some type of gas leak in the building, some reason that people really cannot stay in the building and wait for first responders to get there, or heaven forbid, if something is happening that's affecting multiple high-rise buildings in the city of Chicago and first responders are trying to get people out of all of them, it's going to be potentially a while before those people get some assistance. So I think it is something worth looking into. Depending on your situation, it may or may not be worth it. One of the things that we do, we don't have evacuation chairs at every single exit. We have one on each side of our facility, but there are multiple exits along the way. We have certain people that are trained in using them, and they're there and available. We actually put them in use the last our fire alarms went off, and they were used by a person who wasn't identified as someone who has a disability who's part of the staff, but they had a lot of difficulty navigating stairs because they just had surgery, and so it was helpful in that situation. I would recommend that you do some research and talk to some disability organizations because there are different types that can work better for different people. And then accessible transportation. This might be something for most of you that this is going to be maybe a conversation with your city or your county emergency managers, but if people need to get out of the actual area of your facility, how are they going to do that? Are the routes to accessible transportation, pickup stops accessible for people? And what will be available for people to use if they need to leave the neighborhood or get to a place that is a couple of miles down the road to be able to be safe? And how close is your facility to accessible transportation? When you're thinking about shelter in place, again, you want to think about accessible signage, accessible routes to shelter in place location, You might need evacuation chairs here too. So if your shelter-in-place location is in the basement of your building or the first floor of your building. And access to power. Depending on the type of emergency, if people are sheltering in place for a significant period of time, there are going to be people who might need access to power to recharge equipment. Now, sometimes they might not have a cord or a battery with them, and so in that case, it can be helpful to at least have available some lower tech options for people to use in a pinch. So, like I think our last presenter mentioned when she was talking about evacuation chairs, if you're separating people from their equipment, they're using an evacuation chair to get to a shelter-in-place location. Is there another type of standard wheelchair or something downstairs that somebody could use if they did have to use that? And then you want to have accessible communications about the event. So not just telling people that something is going on and that they need to get into the basement, but once you're there, people want to know what's happening. They want to know if they're safe, what they can do to make sure that their family is safe. And so making sure you have some accessible communication there in that shelter-in-place location is helpful as well. So some of this might be done with some messaging that is pre-recorded or pre-approved. This is what happened. We will let you know when it's all clear and we can all go back upstairs, things like that. But think about how you'll let people know what is going on once they get into the shelter-in-place location. Just some general tips. You want to not separate people from their service animals, from their durable medical equipment or assistive technology, or they're going to have significantly more support needs in the place that they're evacuating to or the place that they're sheltering in place. So whenever possible, try not to separate people. Try not to separate people from their support networks. If they came in with someone who is providing them some assistance, there's no reason to separate people out into people with disabilities and people without disabilities. And then train staff to offer assistance to people with disabilities during the evacuation and provide opportunities for people to request assistance. There are probably going to be people who need some type of assistance that is not already available or they don't know where it's available. So have ways for people to know that they can request additional assistance and ways for them to do that. So it might be, like the last presenter said, talking to people as they come in and say, this is the person who's here, they can, if you need any assistance, talk to them. We use a lot of signage in our disaster recovery centers that say, we have assisted listening devices, we have this type of equipment. If you need any assistance or assistance understanding what's going on, don't hesitate to ask. So provide opportunities for people to request that type of assistance. A couple of resources that you can use. Ready.gov, especially in the business section, has a lot of facility planning guidance, risk assessment tools, and worksheets. There's also a first responder guide for people with disabilities and a workplace emergency planning for people with disabilities document that, if it is okay with Rachel, if I could send, I have a list of helpful documents. If I could send it to you guys and send it out so that you have access to some of these. The first responder guide is helpful because it gives some general tips on interacting with people with disabilities during an emergency. And the workplace emergency planning for people with disabilities is just very comprehensive. It talks about employees with disabilities, but it's certainly applicable to lots of different venues and situations. And then the NFPA, National Fire, I can never remember, Protection Agency Association has a fantastic planning guide and planning checklist for accessible emergency evacuations that's specific to people with disabilities with lots of really good information and resources in it. And I will also send out my contact information with those resources. I'm always happy to chat. If I don't have the answer, I'll try to find somebody to connect you with that you can talk to, and I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has them.
Thanks so much, Jessica. We really appreciate all this great information. People come time to questions.
I'll speak loudly. Hello. My name is Laura Baker. I'm with Victor Gardens Theater. I have a question about how much information you give to a large crowd. Because my instinct is to give them a general understanding and then withhold information until such time that we know more. But I just want to get your thoughts on how much information to divulge and when is the best time to do so.
So I would say, especially if you're at the beginning of an event and you have people coming in, I would just make some announcements at the beginning and say, just so you know, restrooms are here, accessible emergency exits are here, and if there's bad weather and we have to shelter in place, this is what we'll do. And you could talk to any of these people if you have additional questions.
Oh, I'm
Did
sorry.
I understand you correctly?
I mean in the event of an emergency. Sorry, I mean in the event of an emergency. You've already determined that there is an emergency, and now you have to get people maybe out of the building, whatever the event is, that it's already occurring, and now how much information do we give?
I think it depends on where you are in the evacuation process or the shelter-in-place process. When people are getting out of the general area, you can say something like, there's bad weather on the way with potential tornadoes, they're going to be sheltering in place, and then once everyone gets to that location, if there is additional information to give them that then. I would just give some very basic information in the beginning about what it is, and then once people are gathered together in a particular area, if you have more information, you can give that then. But I think the priority is getting people to a safe place.
Any other questions? Okay, I think that ends the program today, so thank you so much, Jessica.
Fade to black. White text on black background. Calling 911. Is your cultural organization prepared for an emergency? Presented by Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium. For workshop resources and more information, visit chicagoculturalaccess.org. Presenting speakers. Vince Gortner, Director of Visitor Services at Morton Arboretum. Presenting via Skype, Sally Garrison, Front of House Coordinator at Tempe Center for the Arts. Jessica Mitchell, Region 5 Disability Integration Specialist at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. Workshop Accessibility, Kathy Raycan, Real-Time Captioning. Video Editing, Captioning, and Audio Description by BridgetMelton.com. Video fades to black.